The shuttle doors opened with a hydraulic hiss, releasing a wave of humid, spore-heavy air into the cabin. Cadets from across the Galactic Coalition stepped out one by one, blinking against the harsh orange light of the jungle moon Tvaka 3. The air shimmered with heat and particles of luminescent pollen. To most of the alien cadets, the place was a paradise wrapped in danger, a proving ground of survival and intellect. To Nick Venn, the only human in the current cohort, it smelled like an old Earth greenhouse, pungent and alive just before a summer storm. He stepped onto the moss-covered platform, boots sinking slightly into the spongy ground. Around him, the others activated hover pads and drone kits, some already deploying weather canopies and energy screens. Nick didn't reach for his tech pack. Instead, he crouched low and dug 2 fingers into the soil. It was wet, layered, recently disturbed. He rubbed the dirt between his thumb and index finger, noting the consistency, clay-rich, faintly alkaline. As he brought it to his nose, a passing Zevran cadet made a retching noise. The fungal species, tall and spindly with porous skin, gave him a wide berth. Nick didn't care. The exam was simple in theory. Survive 5 cycles in the jungle without external aid. No orbital drops, no weaponry beyond what you could carry. The instructors had marked a safe region, but even that came with a catch. Tvaka 3 had one of the highest biodiversity indexes in Coalition-explored space. It was a world where the plants moved, the animals mimicked sound, and even the air could lull one into a toxic sleep if camped in the wrong grove. Most cadets sought clearings, open visibility, stable footing, easy drone flight paths. Nick did the opposite. He moved deeper into the canopy, where roots arched above like petrified snakes and vines swayed as if sentient. He moved silently, listening, not for animals, but for the absence of them. That was always the sign. If even the predators left a place untouched, there was something worse hiding in it. About 50 meters into the tree line, he found it. A hollow depression in the terrain, bowl-shaped and naturally shielded by thick arching roots from 3 surrounding trees. It was lower than the rest of the jungle, and that could mean problems with flooding, but Nick noticed a thin ring of dried, crusted mud along the edge, as if the place once held water but drained efficiently. More importantly, it was surrounded by strange, cone-shaped mounds, each the size of a fist, arranged in no obvious pattern. He knelt by one and split it open with his knife. Inside, a sticky amber substance dripped out slowly, and a sudden flash of translucent wings fluttered before vanishing into the trees. Nick tensed. He had read about the churflies in one of the older logs, a species of acidic winged swarm insects, attracted to heat signatures and movement, known to dissolve the outer carapace of even armored species. Most cadets dismissed the threat, citing that churflies hadn't been spotted in this sector for 2 rotations. But Nick knew better. He recognized the way the forest had changed. The trees were strangely quiet. No buzzing, no birds, no rustling rodents. Just a heavy silence, as if the jungle was holding its breath. He stood up, scanning the treetops, and noticed faint cuts in the bark of several surrounding trees. Old claw marks, likely from animals escaping in a rush. That confirmed it. The swarm hadn't arrived yet, but it would, probably soon. He took a deep breath and set down his gear. While other cadets assembled shelters from flexible alloy panels and deployed temperature-controlled tents, Nick began digging. He used a collapsible spade, but only for the first hour. After that, he switched to a flat piece of bark shaped like a shovel and dug in rhythmic motions, circling the depression with a shallow trench. As he worked, he gathered fibrous leaves, charred wood, and bitter-smelling roots that oozed dark resin when split. He crushed the roots with stones, then mixed the pulp with the mud from the trench. Every hour or so, he stopped and chewed on raw bark, not for nourishment, but to help calm his nerves. The jungle seemed to pulse with anticipation. Occasionally, a drone zipped overhead, one of the surveillance units monitoring the cadets' progress. Nick didn't look up. He knew they'd be watching the others, those building textbook shelters and following coalition protocol. His work didn't fit the models. By sunset, his camp looked nothing like the others. Instead of a raised dome or floating cocoon, Nick had constructed a dugout ring, padded with wet leaves, and a tent-like canopy made of stitched vines, reinforced with sticky tree sap. The moat around him shimmered in the twilight, now filled with water and ash he had gathered from a burnt stump nearby. The bitter smell of the root paste lingered in the air. It was crude, ugly, and entirely wrong by coalition standards. But Nick wasn't interested in appearances. He understood instinct. Earth had trained him that way, not with lectures, but with experience. He had spent months in the Amazon basin, volunteered for deep terrain training in Congo zones still untouched by satellites, and read every pre-modern survival manual he could get his hands on. He believed that old dangers often repeated themselves in new forms. The only difference was whether you listened before the storm or during it. That night, as darkness fell, Nick sat near the edge of his trench with his fire barely flickering, low enough to keep heat signatures down, but just bright enough to see his own hands. Around him, the jungle grew still. The wind stopped. Even the distant clicks of insect legs on tree bark faded into nothing. And in that silence, Nick knew he had made the right choice. He leaned back slowly, pulling a blanket of dried leaves over himself, masking scent and shape. He closed his eyes, not to sleep but to wait. The exam had truly begun. The jungle, ancient and indifferent, was preparing to test them all. And Nick, the lone human among interstellar cadets, had listened to its whispers. The night did not fall quietly on Tvaka 3. It dropped like a curtain of pressure, thickening the air, muting every sound, and coiling around the jungle like a tightening fist. Nick lay beneath his leaf canopy, his breathing slow and measured, eyes open and alert in the darkness. He counted the seconds between the last rustle of a branch and the first unnatural vibration in the air. The silence was not peaceful. It was expectant, almost reverent, as if the forest itself knew what was coming. He gripped the edge of his makeshift trench and waited. The temperature began to climb, even though the sun had long since vanished beyond the tree line. A damp, suffocating heat rose from the ground, carrying with it the sharp tang of decay and something else, an acidic bite that stung the inside of his nose. His instincts stirred. It had begun. The hum came first, barely audible at first, like the low buzz of a distant generator. Then it grew, deepening in pitch, as if thousands of tiny wings were moving in imperfect unison, building toward a crescendo. Nick exhaled softly and pressed his body lower, his limbs tucked close, his scent masked by the paste he had rubbed into his skin earlier. The churflies were arriving. A high-pitched screech tore through the jungle, not from the swarm, but from one of the cadets. A scream of pain, sharp and short, followed by a burst of panic transmitted across the shared comm channel. Nick didn't move. He had expected it. The alien camps had been positioned too close to the open fields, too clean, too warm, and too well lit. To a swarm of churflies that would have looked like a feast prepared with ceremony. The buzzing now filled the air like static electricity, vibrating against Nick's skull. He could feel it in his teeth. The first wave passed over his trench like a rolling fog, shimmering slightly in the dark. Their wings caught fragments of moonlight, reflecting a sickly sheen of green and violet. From the safety of his position, Nick watched as the swarm descended on a camp to his left. He couldn't see which species had built it, but the protective dome lit up violently as energy barriers activated. The churflies responded with fury. Thousands of them clung to the shield's surface, their acidic secretions corroding the energy membrane within seconds. The shield flickered, sparked, and then collapsed. Another scream. This one didn't cut off immediately. It twisted into a gurgling howl that Nick wished he hadn't heard. It lingered too long. He closed his eyes, not from fear, but to shut out the sound and focus on the rhythm of the chaos. He could hear the flutter of wings skimming the edge of his trench. The moat was working. The water, thick with ash and root pulp, repelled them, not because it was toxic, but because it confused their receptors. The insects were drawn to heat and CO2 signatures, but the scent-masking effect of the trench disrupted their senses. To the swarm, his location registered as nothing more than stagnant decay. Another burst of static popped in his comm. A Tharn cadet was shouting orders in her native tongue, rapid, clipped clicks followed by panicked gulps of air. Then silence. Nick turned the comm off. He didn't need it. He had no intention of calling for help or responding to a call. In a situation like this, even communication was a liability. The swarm could follow noise. The next hour stretched on like a test of patience. The jungle burned with movement. In the distance, energy weapons fired sporadically. Short blasts, most likely handheld plasma dischargers. Useless against the numbers. Churflies didn't care about pain. They cared only about saturation. The more heat and motion, the more they attacked. The cadets who fought back were only marking themselves for death. A shadow moved across the edge of his trench. Not a fly, too large. Nick recognized the hunched gait of a Zevran, limping, half covered in resin from a shattered hive. The cadet's breathing was fast and shallow. His porous skin was raw in places where the flies had melted through his surface layer. He stumbled forward, falling just short of Nick's moat. For a moment, Nick hesitated. The Zevran's eyes were wild, unfocused, and his body twitched with erratic spasms. Nick knew that if he crossed the trench to pull the cadet in, he risked exposing himself. If he made even the wrong kind of movement, the swarm could shift in his direction. But the Zevran groaned, a raw, wet sound that barely resembled speech. Nick muttered a curse under his breath and reached for one of the longer branches near his side. He extended it across the trench, hooking the end around the cadet's arm. Slowly, carefully, he dragged him forward until the Zevran's limp body slumped into the inner ring. Nick covered the cadet with spare leaves and doused him with a bit of the trench water to neutralize the pheromones likely clinging to his skin. The Zevran didn't thank him. He barely moved. But Nick didn't need gratitude. He just needed silence. The hours dragged on. Occasionally, Nick saw flashes of other figures in the trees, silhouettes running, diving, collapsing. Some made it as far as the bordering vines. Most did not. The churflies never relented. They moved as a single thinking organism, splitting into clusters, returning to the hive, and then surging back in waves. Nick felt his eyelids grow heavy only once. A slow blink nearly betrayed him, but a sudden vibration through the ground jolted him upright again. A swarm node had landed nearby, a core pod of the hive, surrounded by hundreds of drone insects. He counted 5 long minutes before it moved again, lifting upward with a mechanical buzz as the swarm repositioned across the far clearing. Eventually, as the first hint of pale blue light touched the horizon, the swarm began to recede. It wasn't a retreat, but a withdrawal, a migration to some other feeding ground. The buzzing thinned, the vibrating pressure lifted from his skull, and the jungle slowly remembered how to breathe again. Nick waited until the full light of dawn stretched across the trees before he moved. The Zevran beside him groaned softly, still alive, but barely conscious. Nick checked the cadet's vitals with a simple wristband reader. Blood pressure low, dehydration severe, but stable for now. He sat up slowly, surveying the damage beyond his trench. The jungle was pockmarked with collapsed shelters, snapped trees, and scorched patches of earth where fire had been used in vain. Small pieces of armor and synthetic cloth fluttered on branches like remnants of a lost civilization. Above him, a drone passed again, this time flying slower, its lens focused directly on his camp. It hovered for a full minute, zooming in on the untouched perimeter, the functional trench, and the two figures lying in the center of an otherwise devastated zone. Nick raised one hand, not in a salute, but in silent confirmation. He had survived the worst of the jungle's wrath. Not with lasers or shields, but with mud, ash, and patience. He turned his attention back to the Zevran cadet. The fungal species was barely breathing, but Nick knew he would live if the instructors arrived in time, and if not, at least he wouldn't have died alone in the open. That mattered. The jungle had gone quiet again. But this time, the silence was real. Not a warning, but a sigh of relief. The test wasn't over, not yet, but the worst had passed. For now. The morning haze rolled low through the jungle, filtering sunlight into pale beams that sliced between twisted branches and dangling vines. A heavy dampness clung to everything, the leaves, the bark, even the air itself, like the jungle was sweating after a violent fever. Nick crouched near the edge of his trench, his fingers trailing lazily through the water. The ash had settled into thin gray streaks, and the root pulp clumped at the corners, forming a viscous layer that still released the sharp, earthy scent he had relied on to mask his presence. The Zevran cadet had not spoken, but his shallow breathing had deepened sometime before sunrise. Nick had already patched 2 of the larger acid burns across his porous arms, using moss soaked in antiseptic sap, and had wrapped the lower limbs with strips torn from his own sleeping cloth. He had no delusions about the cadet's comfort. Zevran biology was largely misunderstood even in medical circles, but stabilizing him was the only humane course of action. By mid-morning, the instructors arrived. Not on foot, of course. Coalition officials never stepped directly into dangerous terrain unless protocol demanded it. Instead, 3 hoverpods descended from the upper canopy, displacing clouds of insects as they released decontamination mist across the ground. Nick stood silently as one of the pods extended a pair of automated arms, gently lifting the injured Zevran and pulling him into the containment shell. A second pod scanned the perimeter of Nick's trench, its sensors emitting quiet hums and flickers of light across the muddy surface. The third remained motionless, its camera fixed on Nick's face, studying him more closely than any alien swarm ever had. He didn't speak until one of the drone voices filtered through the static. "State the nature of this structure." Nick straightened his posture. "Defensive barrier," he said. "Biological deterrent. Moisture and ash mixture. Root resin for scent masking. Dug overnight." A pause. "Source of knowledge for design? Field observation. Pre-technological Earth tactics. Behavior-based defense." The drone emitted a low tone, approval perhaps, or a marker for further analysis, and then rose higher, drifting away in the direction of the ruined camps. Nick turned and began reassembling his canopy. He had no intention of moving. The test wasn't over yet, and unless instructed otherwise, he planned to remain exactly where he was. Later that afternoon, another cadet emerged from the jungle's far edge. She was tall and pale-skinned, her crystalline armor cracked and caked in yellow mud. Her species, Tharn, were known for their intellect and sensory acuteness, and she walked with the stiff elegance of someone taught from birth to preserve posture under all conditions. She approached slowly, arms raised, signaling peace. Nick didn't lower his guard. He nodded once, then pointed toward a dry patch within the trench perimeter. She stepped over the barrier with care, inspecting the water without touching it. "I am called Silene," she said. Her voice was soft but firm. "You are Nick Venn, yes?" He nodded again. "Your perimeter kept the swarm away." "That's what it was built to do." She knelt beside him without further hesitation. Her joints moved with mechanical precision, every motion controlled. "I had a shield. It lasted 2 minutes. Then my second shelter fell. After that, I ran. I saw yours still standing." She didn't sound ashamed, just analytical. Her species rarely conveyed emotion openly. "You dug a trench?" He pointed to the edges. "Surrounding scent barrier, saturated ash, swamp water base, resin from bitter root clusters 2 kilometers east." "You improvised this overnight?" "Yes." She studied him for a long time, then looked around the camp. "The others will come. They saw the drone footage." He didn't ask who she meant, but he knew she was right. Survival was no longer just an individual challenge. Now it had become political. Someone had done something that worked. And that meant explanations, examinations, maybe even accusations. By dusk, 3 more cadets arrived, 2 injured, 1 limping, and all hollow-eyed. None of them approached Nick directly. Instead, they stood just outside the trench, whispering to one another in harsh syllables and fragmented dialects. One was clearly from the Othad race, feathered, high-shouldered, with twitching claws. The other 2 he couldn't identify under the layers of mud and burned equipment. Silene stood as they hesitated. "This perimeter saved me. It may save you." One of them scoffed. "It's mud and garbage." She didn't blink. "It's what worked." Eventually, one cadet stepped forward and mimicked Nick's earlier motion, kneeling, then slowly stepping across the trench. The others followed. Nick didn't offer help, but he didn't resist either. His camp now held 5 cadets, 2 conscious, 3 resting, 1 near death. The tension hung between them like smoke. That night, as the jungle cooled, Silene returned to the edge of the trench and spoke without turning her head. "You should name it." "What?" "This," she gestured around the perimeter. "The method, the trench, the mixture. It will be studied now. It may be repeated. You should name it before others do." He considered the thought. He had never wanted fame. He wasn't here to be studied. But the swarm had proven something he already believed. That survival wasn't about the best tools. It was about seeing what others didn't, about listening. "I'll think about it," he said quietly. The next morning brought more drones, more questions. Coalition scientists now watched from orbit, reviewing Nick's design through high-magnification lenses. A small module dropped nearby containing sterile containers, requesting samples of his ash mixture. He gave them freely. Let them test it, dissect it, replicate it. As the 5th sun rose, the jungle around the trench stood mostly quiet. No buzzing, no screams, just the quiet murmur of injured cadets healing inside a mud-lined shelter built by instinct and memory. Nick sat against the root wall, sharpening a piece of bark with his knife, not because he needed a weapon, but because the repetition kept his mind focused. Silene sat beside him, watching the jungle through narrow slits in the canopy. "When you saw the mounds," she asked, "what told you they were nests?" "The silence," he said. Everything else avoided them. She tilted her head, crystalline strands catching light. "You listened to what wasn't there." "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Most beings listen for what is loudest, not what is absent." Nick said nothing. He didn't need to. The camp had become a symbol now, though he hadn't meant it to be. A statement made in ash and mud, not words, not rebellion, not genius, just awareness. The understanding that in a galaxy filled with technology, sometimes the answer was older than memory. And as more cadets trickled into the camp, whispering about how the human had survived the night that others hadn't, Nick felt no pride, only certainty that he had done what was needed. Nothing more, nothing less. The jungle shifted after the 3rd night. Not in noise or temperature, but in tension, like a collective inhale before confrontation. The silence around the trench was no longer peaceful. It had weight. Nick felt it each time he stepped beyond the moat to collect dry bark or check the soil's saturation. It wasn't the jungle watching him now. It was the others. The ones who had survived, but hadn't forgotten who hadn't warned them. By morning, the camp was crowded. Cadets of different species had come from as far as the outer ridges of the test zone. Some arrived limping, others trailing makeshift stretchers with the injured. A few had working drones still hovering above them, recording every movement and mapping every step. The trench, once his quiet defense, had become a magnet for attention, scrutiny, and, soon enough, division. The first accusation came from a Vorax cadet, a thick-skinned species with bony ridges across his shoulders and jaw. He stood tall in the center of the camp, his voice booming louder than necessary. "You knew about the swarm," he shouted, pointing a clawed finger at Nick. "You let us all walk into it while you built that hole." Nick didn't respond immediately. He secured the vine net he had been tying between two trunks, then rose slowly and turned to face him. His eyes were calm, unreadable. "I suspected," he said plainly. "Suspected?" The Vorax stepped closer, chest puffed. "And you didn't send a warning across the comm? Not a signal? Not a flare? You just sat in your pit and listened to us scream?" Celine stepped between them before Nick could speak again. Her crystalline frame blocked the sun in angled refractions. "Survival was the test," she said firmly. "Each cadet was responsible for his or her own choices." The Vorax growled low. "He made a choice to protect only himself." Nick met the cadet's gaze. "I made a choice not to die. If I had shouted warnings, the swarm would have come faster." A silence fell. Others were listening now, some nodding subtly, others whispering behind half-lowered hoods. The truth wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hard to understand. In survival, sound was death. Fear was bait. Later that day, the instructors arrived, not through drones this time, but in person, a sign that the matter had escalated past routine observation. 3 of them emerged from a camouflaged skimmer that descended noiselessly above the canopy, their uniforms black and silver, the coalition crest shimmering across each chest. The lead instructor, a long-necked Shalari named Commander Heth, addressed the group from the center of the camp. His voice echoed with the weight of command. "Protocol breach accusations have been filed," he announced. "Cadet Nick Venn stands under preliminary inquiry for deliberate concealment of environmental threats." Nick stood without being summoned. "I'll answer." Commander Heth motioned for silence. "You will be allowed to give your explanation after review of collected data." A side panel on the instructor's arm lit up, projecting a series of recordings, drone footage, thermal scans, moments captured during the swarm's peak. One by one, scenes flickered. Energy barriers collapsing, cadets running through underbrush, the swamp water around Nick's trench glowing cold and undisturbed. A moment froze, Nick pulling the Zevran cadet into safety with the branch. The projection paused. Commander Heth looked up. "Your shelter withstood the entire event. You aided others, but you issued no warning. Why?" Nick answered steadily. "Because there wasn't time. I made decisions based on instinct and limited data. If I had been wrong, my noise would have cost more lives. And if you had been right, which you were, then my silence allowed me to create something others could later use." The second instructor, a short-furred Trellic, stepped forward. "Explain your design again, start to finish." Nick did. He spoke of soil density, of root patterns, of the scent-blocking properties in the bitter root clusters. He described the ash's role in masking thermal trails and how stagnant water acted as a mirror to redirect heat. He spoke without emotion, but with clarity, not defending himself, just stating the facts. When he finished, there was a long pause. The instructors exchanged glances. The Trellic stepped back. Commander Heth addressed the group again. "Survival strategy does not require sharing, but exceptional strategies, once proven effective, are required to be documented. Nick Venn, your method, though primitive, is effective. Your actions saved lives. You are cleared of misconduct. This design will be studied for inclusion in the official training protocol." Whispers broke out across the camp. Some voices were curious, others irritated, and a few, grudgingly respectful. The Vorax cadet said nothing. He turned away, his pride too wounded to speak. That night, Nick sat near the fire pit, now communal. The trench had been widened in several areas, more cadets choosing to replicate his barrier in smaller segments. A few had even begun crafting crude moats near their own temporary shelters. The design was catching on. Silene sat beside him again, hands folded neatly in her lap. "It worked," she said. He nodded. "It worked." But it wasn't just the trench. He turned slightly. "No." She didn't press further. She knew what he meant. It had been the timing, the silence, the patience. The trench was only the physical part of the solution. The real survival came from restraint, doing less, not more. In a galaxy obsessed with innovation, it was an uncomfortable lesson. Later that evening, a small delegation of instructors returned. One of them handed Nick a thin, silvered data rod. "Your design will be archived," she said. "It requires a designation. Do you have one?" He looked at the rod, then out toward the jungle. The trees were tall and swaying now, no longer stiff with tension. The sky had softened into deep violet, and the first stars had begun to appear. "Call it the Venn barrier," he said finally. The instructor nodded and walked away without ceremony. The others continued their work, building, documenting, comparing soil mixes. But Nick remained seated, watching the jungle breathe. The camp no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a message written in mud, spoken in silence. Nick woke before the sun crested the jungle rim. The sky was still the color of old slate, soft and quiet. The vines above the trench fluttered slightly in the breeze, and dew clung to the edges of the ash-coated moat like crystal dust. He sat up slowly, muscles aching but mind clear. The fifth and final cycle of the survival exam had begun, and with it, the last hours before extraction. The camp had grown overnight. Not in size, there were no walls, no flags, no beacons, but in weight. It now held the collective memory of survival. The makeshift shelters, the scattered tools, the wet ash still lining trenches dug by dozens of cadets, all of it testified to a shift. This place, once deemed a test site, had become something more, a symbol, a statement. He stepped over a narrow log and walked to the outer edge of the camp, where fresh mud had been shoveled into half-formed ridges by a group of younger cadets from the distant Virex colony. One of them, a slim, four-armed humanoid named Ralik, looked up as Nick approached. "Does it need to be deeper?" Ralik asked, eyes wide and uncertain. Nick squatted beside him and examined the trench. "It depends. Are you planning to burn resin again tonight?" "Yes. The root paste and some bark. Then widen it by a hand's length. That'll hold more moisture and keep the mixture dense." Ralik nodded quickly and resumed digging. Nick didn't say anything else. He simply stood and walked back toward the center of the camp, where the main gathering ring had formed. 6 large stones arranged in a loose circle around the fire pit, now used not just for warmth, but for shared meals and instruction. Selene was already there, sitting with her legs folded beneath her, crystalline skin shimmering in the pale morning light. She was explaining something to a small group of cadets, demonstrating how to use leaf fibers to weave longer-lasting barriers for sleeping mats. Her voice was precise and slow, but never patronizing. Nick stood behind her, listening for a few moments before moving on. He passed by the older Tharn medic who had returned the night before with a few of the senior instructors. The medic was collecting samples from the plants Nick had marked earlier, the bitter root clusters, the ash-coated vines, the bark that bubbled when burned. When she saw Nick, she gave him a short nod of professional acknowledgement and returned to her work. She said nothing, but he knew what her silence meant. Respect earned, not given. By midday, a new pod descended, this one larger, carrying the final evaluation crew. Commander Heth stepped out, followed by 2 archivists and a scientific observer. The mood in the camp shifted again, this time not from fear or tension, but from anticipation. Everyone knew the exam was over. What remained now was legacy. Nick didn't approach the commander. He had no interest in titles or debriefings. Instead, he returned to his original shelter and began dismantling it. The vines, carefully tied days ago, were loosened. The dried leaves used to mask his heat signature were folded neatly and stacked. The trench, his trench, was left untouched, not out of laziness, but because it no longer belonged to him. It had been named, documented, archived. That simple barrier, born from instinct and earth-honed caution, now lived in 100 recordings, scans, and reports. Still, as he worked, he felt someone watching. Commander Heth finally approached, silent as ever, stepping over the perimeter and standing beside the remains of the ash basin. "Most cadets leave their shelters intact," the commander said. "I came here to survive, not to leave a monument," Nick replied. Heth glanced around. "Too late for that." Nick gave a short breath that might have been a laugh. He kept pulling vines free. The commander waited a moment, then continued. "Your design has been submitted to Coalition Protocol. It will be added to the Adaptive Survival module in the Academy's curriculum. Simulation labs are already testing variants." Nick looked up, surprised. "Already?" "Word travels fast when cadets live because of mud and fire." He nodded once and returned to work. Commander Heth didn't leave. After a few minutes, the commander asked, "What do you think they'll remember?" Nick paused. He stared at the trench, now filled with murky water, edges hardened by days of pressure. Around it, new lines had formed, moats dug by others, slightly different but unmistakably inspired. "They'll remember that technology isn't always the answer," he said. "That sometimes listening to the forest matters more than scanning it. That you don't have to be advanced to be prepared." Heth gave a soft grunt of agreement. A lesson long overdue. When the sun finally began its descent, casting amber fire through the trees, the extraction signal sounded. A single chime echoed from above, and within minutes, the first skimmers broke through the canopy. They hovered like insects, elegant and silent, touching down on the flattest patches of soil. One by one, cadets packed their gear and lined up. Some took pieces of bark with them. Others carried samples or small journals marked with diagrams of their trench variations. The Venn barrier was no longer just a name. It had become a blueprint. Nick was the last to pack. He stood at the edge of the camp for a moment, eyes on the trees, listening. The jungle no longer whispered danger. It hummed with strange peace, as if it, too, recognized what had been earned here. Celine approached him just before he stepped into the transport. She extended a crystalline shard, thin, polished, with a symbol etched at its center. "What's this?" he asked. "A Tharn memory crystal," she said. "We record moments that alter perception. Yours altered mine." He accepted it without a word, fingers closing around it carefully. Then he boarded the skimmer and rose above the jungle, watching the camp vanish beneath the leaves, a smudge of ash and mud in a sea of green. Months later, in a sterile training room on the orbiting Coalition Academy, a group of young cadets would sit in a circle as their instructor activated a projection. Holographic vines grew around them. A trench shimmered to life. A voice narrated the method, calm and clear. They would call it the Venn barrier. They would learn it as protocol. But Nick would remember it simply as the thing that kept him alive, and reminded everyone that even in a galaxy full of wonders, sometimes survival was about knowing when to stay still, when to listen, and when to dig.